I'm to the stage of putting the finish on the guitar now. I've sanded the back and sides to 220, and now I'm going to fill the pores in the koa. So I've masked off the top and the neck because I don't want to get any of the filler on them if I can avoid it. I just want to fill the koa because the pores are, well, these don't look too bad on this particular piece, but sometimes they're quite large, not as big as rosewood, but large enough that if I don't use filler, I wind up having to spray a lot more lacquer than I want to, just to be able to build up the pores and get a mirror smooth surface. I'm using something called Z-epoxy. It's an epoxy resin, and I like it more than most of the traditional woodworking pore fillers. I guess they're silica based. It's super messy putting it on, but it's easier to work with once it's on the wood. After any filler, after it's been on the wood for a while and dried, you have to sand it off. And you don't want any left on the surface, you just want it in the pores of the wood. And I find that this both fills the pores very effectively and is easier to sand than most of the other products I've worked with. So the idea is you kind of squeegee it on first perpendicular to the grain, and then sort of diagonal to it, and then finally parallel. And that, as I said, seems to work pretty well for me, but it is a mess. Really brings out the beauty of the koa. And the trick with this is to not leave any excess on the surface, because the more that's left on, the more I have to sand. Alright, now I'll do the sides. And this has to sit overnight before I can sand it. I let the sealer sit overnight. It's completely dry. There are some spots, the shiny spots, where it's a little thick, so I can scrape off the surface and it'll save me a little sanding effort. And then once I've done that everywhere, I'll start sanding, and I'll sand all of the koa surfaces back to bare wood, and then I'll be ready to prep the whole guitar for spraying, meaning I have to sand more, get up to at least 220 grit, and then I'll start putting lacquer on. been a few weeks since I finished spraying lacquer, so now it's time to start doing the leveling by way of sanding, and then once I get it all sanded I can start buffing. I start with 320 grit paper and work my way up to 1,000 grit, and it's not one of my favorite activities, but a necessary step. I've just finished sanding the lacquer up to 1,000 grit, so now I'm gonna just do a little bit of light buffing, just to knock the dullness off and get it looking a little bit shiny. It will get rid of all this powder and also start showing where I've got some finish imperfections still, and of course where I need to sand to get rid of the imperfections. So that's the idea. It's got a little bit of a shine to it now, and obviously I have to do the sides and the neck still. I find that the sanding process really softens the lacquer quite a bit, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't really buff it to a high shine today. I will finish this first go round with the sides and the neck, and then I'll just set the guitar down for a day at least and come back to the buffing after the lacquer has had a chance to re-harden. I'm finishing up the second day of buffing, and it's really, the lacquer is taking a nice shine now. I think the fact that I let it harden up overnight really makes a big difference, but I don't know how well it shows in the camera, but it's getting quite shiny. I'm not in a huge hurry. I find this pretty back-breaking to be hunched over the buffing wheels, so I don't try to do it all at once. I haven't done the neck yet today, so I'll buff the neck and finish up this side, and then let it sit and rest my back, and probably tomorrow finish up the buffing. And it's just about ready for me to take the tape off the fretboard and get the bridge glued on, but I've got some little details that still have to be addressed, specifically the neck joint. This area is really hard to buff, or to sand smooth and then buff, just because it's such a tight corner. So it's basically impossible to get in there with a sanding block because they just aren't crisp and sharp enough. So what I like to do is I'll take a piece of spruce, or I guess any wood would do, and I plane a bevel onto one edge of it. It's quite thin to begin with, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. So I put a bevel along one edge, well, one end, and then one long edge. And that allows me to wrap the sandpaper very tightly, because the bevel is just down to a point, so I can wrap my sandpaper around that sharp point and then do all of the necessary sanding, and I get right into that corner. I don't have to be real aggressive with this because the imperfections are pretty minor at this point. But by having the bevel on the end also, I can flip this over since I'm not completely ambidextrous and sand from both sides of the neck joint. So I will do this starting with 320 grit and work my way up to 1,000. A little more. The mineral spirits, I had always read how you lubricate sandpaper to float the particles off of the lacquer surface, but I really think that what it does is keeps the sandpaper from clogging up. The particles are still there, but they just don't seem to gum up the paper the way they do if it's dry. And after I'm done with the sanding, I have this felt pad. I bought a bunch of these years ago, and I cut a piece of it and glued it to a stick. So it's just at this end, so that gives it more rigidity. So I take some Meguiar's number 4 and just put a little bit on the felt pad and rub on all the scratches that I left from the sandpaper. Try to go in a circular pattern as much as possible, because if you just go straight up and down, you're going to make a whole set of fine scratches that way. The felt pad is just a little bit proud of the stick, so I can do this kind of movement without worrying about the wooden stick scratching the lacquer. So I pretty much do this until the rubbing compound just disappears. Of course, if you put too much compound on the pad to begin with, you could be doing this for a long time. And after I finish with this compound, this is Meguiar's Mirror Glaze number 4, then I switch to Meguiar's number 7 and do the same thing. And then finally I finish it off with Meguiar's Clear Plastic Cleaner. Really, I'm not an ad for Meguiar's products. I've just found that these worked over the years, and so I keep going back to them. Whoa, that's a mess. Anyway, I'm sure there are plenty of other hand rubbing compounds and abrasives that would do this job, but I use Meguiar's because it has worked for me. I could stop there and it would look perfectly acceptable, but I've got this handy Fordham rotary tool, and I put a small buffing wheel on it, and I'm just going to do kind of a quick lick and a promise with this. It doesn't get right into the very corner because the pad is flexible, so it just kind of rounds off, but it'll take care of any stray scratches that are like, you know, a ½ inch out from that corner, quarter-inch out. And just give it a nice final polish. All right. That's done. And of course, this is the same technique I used for going around the fretboard extension on the body. So now I can take the tape off the fretboard and where I had marked off the bridge location and get the bridge put on.